It was supposed to be a normal day, the kind of day that blends into memory with noise, excitement, and nothing more than the outcome of a match. On April 15, 1989, thousands of fans made their way toward Hillsborough Stadium in Sheffield, England, gathering for an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest. It was a big game, but not an unusual one, not something that suggested danger, not something that carried any visible risk. Supporters arrived in waves, filling the streets around the stadium with energy that felt familiar, almost routine. Conversations overlapped, scarves were raised, and the sense of anticipation grew as kickoff approached. Everything about the scene felt normal, structured, controlled, the way large sporting events are expected to be. But as the crowd moved closer to the Leppings Lane end, where Liverpool supporters were directed, that sense of control began to shift. The number of people arriving exceeded the capacity of the turnstiles handling entry, and what started as a steady flow slowed into congestion. Lines formed, then stretched, then compressed as more fans continued to arrive behind those already waiting. At first it was just delay, then pressure, then something harder to ignore. The crowd outside the entrance grew tighter, movement becoming restricted as space began to disappear. Those at the back continued pushing forward, not out of intent, but because they had no clear awareness of what was happening ahead. Those near the front were caught between the pressure behind them and the limited space ahead. Inside the stadium, the central standing pens behind the goal were already filling. These sections were enclosed by high metal fences, designed to control crowd movement and prevent pitch invasions. Under normal conditions they worked as intended. But they were not designed for what was about to happen. Outside, the pressure continued to build. The flow of people did not stop. Could not stop. Thousands were still arriving, still moving forward, still expecting entry. The density increased to a point where individual movement was no longer fully controlled. People were no longer walking freely. They were being carried by the movement of the crowd. At that moment, a decision was made to relieve the situation outside. A large exit gate was opened, allowing fans to enter quickly without passing through the turnstiles. It solved one problem immediately. The pressure outside eased, the crowd surged forward, and movement resumed. But inside, nothing had changed to receive them. There was no redirection. No control guiding them away from already crowded areas. No system to distribute them safely. And so, naturally, people followed the most visible path, moving through the tunnel that led directly into the central pens. It was the shortest route. The most obvious route. The route that felt correct. But it was also the most dangerous. Because those pens were already near capacity. As more people entered, the space inside began to compress. At first, it felt like any crowded event, bodies close together, movement limited but still manageable. Then the density increased further, and the nature of the crowd began to change. Movement stopped being voluntary. Pressure replaced control. People were no longer choosing where to stand. They were being pushed into position by the force of those around them. Near the front, individuals were pressed against the metal fencing that separated the crowd from the pitch. At first, it was uncomfortable. Then it became restrictive. Then it became something else entirely. Breathing became harder. Space disappeared completely. And the realization began to spread, slowly at first, then all at once. Something was wrong. Those deeper inside the pens tried to move, to create space, to step back, but there was nowhere to go. The crowd behind them continued to push forward, unaware of the conditions ahead. From outside the pens, the situation did not immediately appear dangerous. It looked like a large, tightly packed crowd, something that had been seen before at major matches. There was no visible signal of what was happening within the compressed sections. But inside, the conditions had already crossed a critical threshold. Because in a confined space, when density reaches a certain point, the crowd itself becomes the force. Individual strength no longer matters. Movement is dictated by pressure, and pressure does not respond to intention. People began to shout. Not in celebration, in distress. But their voices were absorbed into the noise, into the scale of the crowd, into a situation that had not yet been fully recognized for what it was. Near the front, the pressure intensified further. Those against the fencing were now unable to move at all, their bodies compressed to the point where even breathing required effort. Others behind them continued to push forward, not out of aggression, but because they could not stop the movement of the crowd behind them. The structure of the pens, designed to contain movement, now prevented escape. High metal fences blocked the sides. Barriers separated sections. There were limited exits, and those exits were not easily reachable from within the crush. What had been designed for control had become a trap. And still, from the outside, the full reality had not yet been understood. The match was about to begin. The stands were full. And inside those central pens, the situation was no longer developing. It had already reached the point where control was gone. Because when a crowd becomes too dense, when space disappears completely, when movement is no longer a choice, the outcome is no longer shaped by decisions. It is shaped by physics. And in that moment, inside those confined sections, physics had already taken over. What followed did not happen all at once. It unfolded in layers, each second adding pressure, each movement reducing the little space that remained. Inside the central pens, people were no longer standing in a crowd. They were locked into it, held in place by the force around them, unable to step back, unable to turn, unable to create even a small gap to breathe. At first, many tried to adjust, shifting their weight, lifting their arms, attempting to relieve the pressure on their chest. But there was no room to move. The crowd behind continued to push forward, not because they wanted to, but because they had no control over the force coming from behind them. The effect spread quickly. Those in the middle felt it next, then those further back. The density increased to a point where individual balance became unstable. When one person leaned, others were forced to lean with them. When one section compressed, the pressure transferred outward, creating waves of force that moved through the crowd without warning. This was no longer a gathering. It was a system under stress. Near the front, against the fencing, the situation became critical. People were pressed so tightly that their bodies could not expand to take a full breath. The pressure on the chest increased with every second, making it harder to inhale, harder to remain conscious. Some tried to climb the fences. Some tried to signal for help. Arms reached upward, not in celebration but in desperation. But from outside the pens, the signals were not immediately understood. Stewards and police officers positioned near the pitch saw movement, saw raised arms, but the scale of the problem was not yet clear. From their perspective, it still appeared as overcrowding, not an emergency. Inside, the situation continued to worsen. People began to collapse. Not from injury but from lack of air. When one person fell, it created a void, a small space that others were forced into, increasing the pressure on those still standing. The structure of the crowd shifted again, becoming even more unstable. Those who remained conscious tried to help, pulling others up, trying to create space, but there was nothing to work with. The environment allowed no room for recovery. Communication broke down. Voices were lost in the noise. And time, in that space, moved differently. Seconds felt longer, heavier, as the conditions continued to intensify. On the pitch side of the fence, a few began to notice that something was wrong. Fans climbed over barriers, dropping onto the field, signaling distress more clearly. Some players and officials started to look toward the stands, trying to understand what was happening. But by then, the situation inside the pens had already passed the point of control. Because crowd crush is not sudden in appearance, but it becomes irreversible once a certain density is reached. At that point, no instruction, no command, no attempt to manage the crowd can immediately reverse what is already happening. The force does not stop instantly. It continues. And inside those pens, people were still being pushed forward, still being compressed, still losing the ability to breathe. Eventually, the scale of the crisis began to break through. More people climbed onto the pitch. More signals were visible. The match itself was delayed, then stopped as attention shifted from the game to the stands. But stopping the match did not stop the pressure. Because the crowd inside the pens was still trapped. Barriers remained in place. Movement was still restricted. And those who needed immediate help were still surrounded by conditions that made that help difficult to reach. Some barriers were eventually opened. Sections of fencing were broken or climbed over, creating limited escape points. People were pulled out, one by one, lifted over barriers, carried onto the pitch by others who had managed to reach them. For some, that help came in time. For others, it came too late. The scene on the field began to change. What had been a football pitch became a place of emergency response. Individuals were laid on the grass, efforts made to revive them, to restore breathing, to do anything that could reverse what had already happened. But the reality was already clear, even if it was not yet fully acknowledged. This was not just overcrowding. This was not just a disruption. This was a disaster. And it had unfolded in a way that no one had fully recognized until it was already too late to prevent its worst consequences. As the pressure inside the pens finally began to ease, what remained was not relief, but realization. The movement that had once forced people forward started to break apart, not because the system had been corrected, but because sections of the crowd had already collapsed. Space returned slowly, unevenly, revealing what had been hidden just moments before. On the pitch, the scene transformed completely. What had been a football match became an emergency response zone. Players, officials, police officers, and supporters all moved with the same urgency, not guided by protocol but by instinct. People were being carried out from the stands, lifted over barriers, placed onto the grass wherever there was space. Some were conscious, some were not. And in many cases, it was difficult to tell the difference. Attempts to help began immediately. Those closest tried to assist, performing resuscitation, calling for medical aid, doing what they could with what they had. But the resources available were not enough for the scale of what had happened. Equipment was limited, coordination was unclear, and the number of people needing help continued to grow. Inside the stadium, confusion spread. Information moved slowly, often incorrectly, as different sections tried to understand the situation. Some believed it was a pitch invasion. Others thought it was a minor disturbance. The full reality was still forming, still being recognized piece by piece. Outside the stadium, emergency services began to arrive in greater numbers. Ambulances, medical teams, and additional personnel moved toward the scene, but even their arrival could not immediately stabilize the situation. Access points were crowded. Movement was restricted. And the scale of the incident made rapid response difficult. Time became critical. Every second mattered. But inside the stadium, time had already been lost. As more individuals were brought onto the pitch, efforts continued to revive those who had stopped breathing. Some responded. Others did not. The line between those who could be saved and those who could not became clearer with each passing moment. The stands, once filled with noise and anticipation, had fallen into a different kind of silence. Not complete silence, but something heavier, something shaped by shock and disbelief. People looked around, trying to understand how something like this could happen in a place that had seemed so controlled, so familiar. Because nothing about it had felt dangerous at the beginning. Nothing had signaled that the conditions would change so quickly. And yet, within minutes, everything had shifted from routine to irreversible. Authorities began to assess what had happened, but even that process was slowed by the confusion. Communication between different groups was fragmented. Decisions had been made earlier without full awareness of their consequences, and now those consequences were unfolding in real time. The opening of the gate had allowed thousands to enter quickly, but without direction, without control, without a system to prevent overcrowding in already full sections. The design of the pens, intended to manage crowds, had instead trapped them when conditions exceeded what the structure could handle. These factors were not immediately understood in full, but their effects were visible everywhere. On the pitch, in the stands, in the movement of people trying to help without knowing how. Gradually, the situation began to stabilize, not because it was resolved, but because the immediate surge of pressure had ended. Those who could be moved had been moved. Those who could be reached had been reached. But what remained was the aftermath, and the realization that this was not an isolated moment of disorder. It was the result of a chain of events. A sequence of decisions, conditions, and limitations that had aligned in a way that left no room for recovery once the critical point had been reached. Because in a space like that, once control is lost, it cannot be regained instantly. And by the time the scale of the problem becomes visible, the outcome has already been shaped. As the immediate chaos began to settle, the focus shifted from response to understanding. The pitch, which had become a place of urgent action, now held the weight of what had happened. People moved more slowly, more deliberately, as the realization spread that this was no longer a situation that could be reversed. Emergency services continued their work, but the nature of that work was changing. Efforts that had begun as attempts to save lives were now, in many cases, confirming losses. The distinction between rescue and recovery became clearer with each passing minute. Inside the stadium, the atmosphere had changed completely. The noise of the match, the anticipation, the energy that had filled the stands earlier, had been replaced by something else. Something quieter, heavier, shaped by shock rather than movement. Outside, information began to spread, though not always accurately. Reports varied. Numbers were unclear. Details were incomplete. What was certain, however, was that something serious had occurred, something far beyond what anyone had expected from a football match. Authorities began the process of documenting the event, gathering statements, reviewing decisions, trying to piece together how a situation that had seemed manageable had escalated so quickly. Attention turned to the sequence of events leading up to the crush. The congestion outside the turnstiles. The decision to open the gate. The lack of direction once people entered. The design of the pens. Each element on its own did not guarantee disaster. But together, they created conditions where control was gradually reduced until it disappeared completely. And once it was gone, there was no immediate way to restore it. The structure of the stadium became part of the investigation. The high metal fences that had been installed for safety had instead prevented escape. The layout of the entry tunnel directed people toward already crowded sections without any system to redirect them. These were not failures in isolation. They were part of a larger system that had not been designed to handle the situation that developed that day. In the hours that followed, the full scale of the disaster became clearer. The number of casualties, the extent of the injuries, the impact on those who had been there, all began to take shape in reports and records. But numbers alone could not explain what had happened. Because what occurred inside those pens was not defined by a single moment. It was defined by pressure, by density, by the point at which space disappeared and movement was no longer controlled by individuals. Investigations would later examine not only the physical conditions, but the decisions made before and during the event. Why the gate was opened without proper control. Why the crowd was not redirected. Why the signs of danger were not recognized earlier. These questions did not have simple answers. Because the situation had developed gradually, without a clear signal that would force immediate action. Until it reached the point where action was no longer enough. For those who had been inside the pens, the experience did not end when the pressure stopped. The effects remained not only physically but in memory. The awareness of how quickly control had been lost, how little time there had been to react, how limited the options had been once conditions changed. And for those responsible for managing the event, the consequences extended far beyond that day. Because this was not just a failure of space. It was a failure of awareness. A failure to recognize how quickly a controlled environment can become uncontrollable when conditions shift. And as the investigation continued, one reality became unavoidable. This disaster had not been caused by a single mistake. It had been created by a chain of decisions that, together, allowed the situation to reach a point where it could no longer be contained. In the days and weeks that followed, the focus moved beyond the stadium itself and into a wider examination of responsibility. What had happened at Hillsborough Stadium was no longer just an event. It had become a national issue, one that demanded answers, accountability, and a clear understanding of how such a disaster could occur in a setting that was meant to be controlled and safe. Initial explanations did not reflect the full reality. Early reports suggested disorder among fans, framing the situation as a loss of control caused by the crowd itself. But that version did not align with what many had experienced inside the pens. It did not explain the structural limitations, the lack of direction, or the decisions that had shaped the conditions before the crush began. Over time, those differences became more difficult to ignore. Witness accounts began to surface. Testimonies from those who had been there described not chaos, but confinement. Not aggression but compression. Not a sudden incident, but a gradual buildup of pressure that no one inside could control once it reached a certain point. As investigations continued, a more complete picture began to form. The opening of the gate had allowed a surge of people to enter without guidance. The design of the stadium directed them toward central pens that were already near capacity. The fencing prevented escape once the density became critical. These were not isolated failures. They were connected. And together they created the conditions that led to the disaster. Legal processes followed, along with public inquiries that examined the decisions made on that day. Reports were reviewed, evidence reconsidered, and conclusions challenged as new information emerged. The process was not immediate. It extended over years, shaped by ongoing efforts to understand not only what had happened, but how it had been interpreted afterward. Because the aftermath was not just about the event itself. It was also about how the event was understood. And in that space, between experience and explanation, there was conflict. Families of those who had lost their lives continued to seek clarity, pushing for recognition of what had actually occurred. Their efforts brought attention back to the details that had been overlooked or misrepresented, ensuring that the narrative would not remain fixed in its earliest form. Eventually the findings shifted. The disaster was recognized not as a result of fan behavior, but as a failure in crowd management and safety planning. The responsibility moved away from those inside the pens and toward the systems that had failed to protect them. This shift did not undo what had happened, but it changed how it was understood. And that understanding led to change. Stadium safety standards were reviewed and restructured. The use of high-perimeter fencing in standing areas was reconsidered. Crowd management strategies were revised, focusing on flow, visibility, and the ability to respond quickly to changing conditions. These changes extended beyond a single stadium. They influenced how large events were planned and managed across the country, shaping policies that prioritized safety in ways that had not been fully realized before. Because the lesson was clear. Control is not defined by structure alone. It depends on awareness, on communication, on the ability to recognize when conditions are shifting before they reach a critical point. The Hillsborough disaster became more than a tragedy tied to a single day. It became a reference point, a moment that forced a deeper understanding of how crowd dynamics work, how quickly they can change, and how important it is to manage not just space but movement within that space. And even years later, the story remained not only in records and reports, but in the way events were approached differently because of it. Because what happened that day showed something fundamental. That in environments built for control, the greatest risk is often not what is expected. It is what goes unnoticed until it is too late to stop.